Imagine a single piece of legislation that promises to slash taxes, shake up social programs, and even boost border defenses, all at once. This is Donald Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill, a massive proposal unveiled in 2025 during his second term. It's been called ambitious by supporters and alarming by critics. In this video, we'll break down what's inside this sweeping bill, why it's so controversial, and how it could ripple through both the United States and the rest of the world. Stay tuned. The stakes are huge and the story is unfolding as we speak. What is the One Big Beautiful Bill? Donald Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill isn't a typical single-issue law. It's an all-in-one legislative mega package. In Trump's words, it's a big, beautiful solution to deliver on many of his campaign promises in one go. Formally titled the One Big Beautiful Bill Act of 2025, this proposal bundles together major tax cuts, increases in certain spending, like defense and border security, and deep cuts to government programs, all rolled into one giant bill. Objectives and scope. The primary goal of the bill is to extend and expand the tax cuts from Trump's first term. Recall the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Many of those tax breaks were set to expire in 2025. Trump's plan makes most of those cuts permanent and adds new ones on top. But that's not all. The bill also aims to fulfill a broader conservative agenda, beefing up military and border security funding, rolling back welfare programs and other federal spending, and even undoing some of the previous administration's policies, like clean energy incentives. It's essentially Trump's entire second-term agenda distilled into a single, far-reaching piece of legislation. Such an enormous bill has to navigate a special process. It's been packaged as a budget reconciliation measure in Congress. This process allows it to pass with a simple majority vote, avoiding a Senate filibuster. But it also means every piece of the bill must relate to budget changes, taxes, or spending. So, while it touches on many policy areas, tax, healthcare, immigration, etc., each part has a dollars and cents angle to fit the budget rules. Legislative status: as of mid-2025, the One Big Beautiful Bill has narrowly passed the House of Representatives and just squeaked through the Senate after marathon debates. In fact, the Senate vote was razor-thin after nearly 48 hours of amendment voting. However, the House and Senate versions have some differences, so final approval isn't guaranteed. Negotiations to reconcile the bill are intense. The partisan stakes are high. Virtually all Republicans support the broad goals, while Democrats are united in opposition, arguing it's an irresponsible giveaway to the rich at the expense of the vulnerable. Even some fiscally cautious Republicans have had reservations about its impact. This high drama underlines how consequential the bill could be. Now, let's dive into what's actually inside the One Big Beautiful Bill. Key contents of the bill. 1. Trillions in tax cuts. At the heart of OBB is a massive suite of tax cuts, roughly $4.5 trillion worth over the next decade. Here are the highlights. Extending 2017 tax cuts. Trump's signature 2017 tax law lowered income tax rates for individuals and families and doubled the standard deduction. Those cuts were scheduled to expire by the end of 2025. OBB would make those tax cuts permanent, so people wouldn't see their income tax rates jump back up in 2026. This means continued lower tax rates for most brackets and a high standard deduction every year going forward. New tax breaks for workers. Trump pledged that no one will pay taxes on overtime or tips, and the bill delivers, at least temporarily. Income earned from overtime hours and tipped wages would become tax-free for the next few years. In practice, workers could deduct their overtime pay and tip income from taxable earnings, effectively cutting taxes for many hourly and service industry employees. This is pitched as a blue-collar tax break, letting waiters, bartenders, and anyone clocking extra hours keep more of what they earn. Tax relief for families: the child tax credit EOCTC is boosted. Without the bill, the CTC was set to drop from the current $2,000 per child to $1,000 after 2025. Under OBB, not only is the $2,000 credit preserved, it would actually increase to $2,200 per child, starting in 2026. For a family with kids, that means a bigger annual tax refund or reduction. Supporters say this helps families with the cost of raising children, though critics note it's a modest bump and primarily benefits middle-income households. The bill doesn't restore the larger credits for lower-income families that existed temporarily in 2021. Still, avoiding a tax hike on families and slightly enlarging the credit is a selling point. Senior and car buyer perks. The bill would raise the standard deduction for seniors, giving older Americans a larger tax-free portion of their income. And in a unique twist, interest on car loans would become tax deductible, but only for cars made in the USA. This Buy American incentive means if you finance a new car from a US manufacturer, the interest you pay on that loan can be written off on your taxes. It's an unusual tax break designed to boost domestic auto sales and appeal to auto workers and buyers alike. Business and investment tax cuts. OBB isn't just about individual taxes. It also extends tax cuts for businesses. For example, provisions that let companies write off investments faster, like equipment expenses, are brought back. There are continued tax breaks for small businesses, such as keeping the 20% deduction for pass-through business income, and even increasing it slightly to 23% for certain businesses, so small business owners pay less tax. There's also a push to incentivize U.S. manufacturing. Reports indicated Trump wanted a special 15% corporate tax rate for domestic manufacturing operations to bring factories back home. Whether in the final bill or not, the spirit is to make the U.S. more attractive for industry through lower taxes. Trump accounts and other new ideas. The bill creates something dubbed Trump accounts, a new savings account program where Americans could set aside money tax-free. The government would even seed these accounts with a starter contribution for a limited time. While details are technical, think of it as a small boost to personal savings, perhaps for retirement or emergencies, branded under Trump's name. Additionally, there's a new scholarship tax credit, encouraging private donations to fund school scholarships, often a backdoor way to support school choice and private schooling via tax breaks. And charitable giving for non-itemizers would be easier, meaning even if you don't itemize deductions, you could deduct some charity donations, encouraging more philanthropy among average folks. State and local tax, SALT. Cap relief. One key compromise in the bill addresses the state and local tax deduction cap. Currently, taxpayers can deduct at most $10,000 of state-local taxes on their federal return, a cap set in 2017 that hit high-tax states hard. OBB would raise the SALT deduction limit to $40,000 for a few years for many earners. In plain language, people in places like New York or California could deduct more of their hefty state property taxes, reducing their federal tax bill. However, for very high-income households, the cap would phase back down to $10,000, so the ultra-wealthy don't get the full benefit. This change was likely included to win over some skeptical lawmakers from high-tax states, and to show the bill isn't only cutting taxes for the rich, since raising the SALT cap helps upper-middle-class homeowners primarily. In sum, the tax package is sprawling. By preventing many scheduled tax increases and adding new cuts, Trump's bill promises to let Americans keep more of their money. From the waitress keeping all her tip income to the factory owner facing a lighter tax load. 2. Increases in defense and border spending. While cutting taxes typically means less revenue, the bill paradoxically spends more in certain areas. Trump often says national security is worth it, and OBB reflects that with major funding boosts. Military buildup. The legislation pours tens of billions into the Pentagon's budget. This includes money for new Navy ships, advanced missiles, and modern weapon systems, as well as investments in military supply chains and R&D. There's a focus on countering emerging threats, for example, extra funds earmarked for readiness in the Pacific region, a clear signal toward deterring China in the Indo-Pacific. It also increases salaries and benefits for military personnel and aims to ensure the U.S. nuclear deterrent stays robust. In short, Trump's bill significantly hikes defense spending to strengthen America's armed forces. Hawks praise this as overdue reinvestment in the military, while critics question adding military spending on top of tax cuts, given the strain on the budget. Border security and immigration enforcement. This is a centerpiece of the bill. About $350 billion is allocated for border and immigration enforcement initiatives, a staggeringly high figure spread over the coming years. Key elements include finishing and expanding the border wall. Roughly $45 to $50 billion would go directly to constructing new barriers along the U.S.-Mexico border and upgrading security infrastructure. The goal, complete Trump's promised wall and then some. Detention facilities. Around $45 billion is designated to greatly expand capacity for detaining migrants, funding an additional 100,000 detention beds. This means facilities to hold undocumented immigrants, including families, while they await deportation or asylum processing, vastly enlarging the current system. Hiring thousands more agents. The bill funds the hiring of 10,000 new immigration and customs enforcement (ICE) agents by 2029, effectively doubling down on enforcement manpower. Trump has openly declared his intention to carry out the largest mass deportation effort in U.S. history, and these resources for ICE would be the muscle behind that plan. Technology and surveillance. There's funding for high-tech surveillance at the border, more drones, sensors, and a national vetting center to better track entries. Plus, money to help states with border enforcement costs. Some border state governors will be reimbursed for their efforts under this bill. Trump's allies argue these measures will secure the border, reduce illegal immigration, and improve national security. They tie it to combating drug smuggling and human trafficking as well. However, immigrant rights advocates and many Democrats are horrified, calling it an anti-immigrant wish list, enabling mass detentions and deportations on an unprecedented scale. Energy and infrastructure projects. Interestingly, the bill also throws some funding at energy infrastructure. It provides a bit of money to replenish the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, refilling emergency oil stockpiles, and invest in certain energy projects. For instance, expect to see more federal support for traditional energy extraction. New oil and gas leasing on federal lands and offshore are facilitated by the bill. By streamlining permits and mandating lease sales in places like Alaska and the Gulf of Mexico, the administration hopes to boost domestic oil production. This aligns with Trump's energy dominance agenda. It's not huge spending compared to defense, but it's a clear signal of prioritizing fossil fuel projects over green energy. 3. Cuts to healthcare, welfare, and green programs. To partially offset all those tax cuts and new spending, the One Big Beautiful Bill swings an axe at a range of government programs, especially those expanded by previous administrations. Trump and Republican lawmakers frame these not as cuts, but as reforms to rein in government and encourage self-reliance. Here are the major reductions. Medicaid and healthcare. Medicaid, the government health insurance for low-income Americans and people with disabilities, faces significant changes. The bill imposes work requirements for Medicaid recipients, meaning many adults would have to prove they are working or training for a job to keep their health coverage. States would be required to enforce these rules. This alone is projected to save hundreds of billions of dollars, because many people who can't meet the requirement would lose benefits. Additionally, the bill tightens eligibility criteria and reduces federal funding formulas, especially for the Obamacare Medicaid expansion population. Other tweaks aim to root out waste or fraud in health subsidies, for example, checking addresses more frequently to remove ineligible beneficiaries. The bottom line, the bill would slash federal Medicaid spending by roughly $1 trillion over 10 years. According to the Congressional Budget Office, these changes mean about 11 to 12 million fewer Americans would have health insurance by a decade from now compared to current law. That's a huge social impact. Proponents argue the safety net is being refocused on those who truly need it. They claim able-bodied adults who can work should not rely on government health care indefinitely. Opponents warn of people with very low incomes or in fragile situations falling through the cracks, losing coverage and delaying care, ultimately worsening health outcomes. SNAP and food assistance. the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. SNAP, commonly known as food stamps, also sees strict new work requirements and funding cuts. The bill requires states to put up matching funds, so states have more skin in the game for providing food aid, and it closes certain eligibility expansions. It also explicitly bars undocumented immigrants from receiving any SNAP benefits, even indirectly, and reduces some deductions. Like it would no longer factor in internet bills when calculating a household's expenses. A small change that actually reduces benefit amounts a bit. By tightening these rules, the bill saves on SNAP costs, potentially removing millions of people from food stamp rolls over time. Republicans say this encourages employment and reduces dependency. Critics respond that it could increase hunger and hardship for poor families, since about 40 million Americans use SNAP and many might not meet the new rules or could be cut off due to paperwork hurdles. Other social programs. The bill identifies various other savings. Federal student loan programs are overhauled. For instance, a more restrictive repayment plan replaces existing income-based plans, and some student debt forgiveness provisions, like the one for public service or certain school closures, are repealed. These changes aim to reduce future loan cancellation costs and force universities to share in the risk of student defaults. While this saves money, it could make loans slightly less generous for future borrowers and removes any hope of broad loan forgiveness. One line even explicitly forbids presidents from canceling student debt unilaterally. Education grants like Pell might be trimmed for some students, especially non-citizens or those at certain colleges. Additionally, federal workforce reforms are in the mix. Civil service benefits are cut back, e.g., eliminating some early retirement bonuses for government employees and making it easier to fire underperforming workers. This is sold as cutting bureaucratic fat, though it's relatively small savings. Climate and clean energy rollbacks. A notable target is President Biden's clean energy initiatives from the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act. Trump's bill would scale back or repeal a host of green energy tax credits and subsidies. For example, the popular tax credits for buying electric vehicles would be eliminated. Subsidies for solar and wind projects, battery manufacturing, and other renewable investments would be phased out. In total, roughly $300 to $400 billion worth of clean energy incentives are on the chopping block. Republicans argue that this corrects an imbalance, claiming Biden's policies unfairly favored green industries and distorted the market. They also see it as saving taxpayer money that was handing out subsidies to big companies. On the flip side, environmental advocates warn that this could significantly slow down America's transition to clean energy, undermining efforts to combat climate change. Jobs in the renewable sector might be at risk, and the U.S. could cede leadership in green technology. This part of the bill has raised concern among international partners, since it signals the U.S. pulling back on climate commitments. We'll touch more on global reaction in a moment. Other budget offsets. The bill also finds some revenues through fees and taxes aimed at specific groups. For instance, it introduces a small excise tax on money transfers, remittances, sent abroad, which would particularly affect immigrants sending money to family overseas. This idea was floated as a way to make foreign nationals contribute, or even indirectly fund border security. There are also higher visa application fees and immigration-related fees. So foreign tourists, students, and immigrants will pay more, generating billions in revenue. Large private universities with big endowments would see a bigger tax on their investment earnings, a populist jab at wealthy Ivy League schools. Corporations will face a tighter cap on how much executive pay they can deduct as a business expense, essentially discouraging huge CEO pay packages or at least making them taxable to the company. And in a move aimed at online retail imports, the bill lowers the threshold at which imported goods incur tariffs, closing the de minimis loophole that allowed a flood of untaxed small packages, often from China, into the country. This could mean more import duties collected and a bit more protection for U.S. retailers against cheap e-commerce imports. Add up all these cuts and offsets, and they still don't fully pay for the tax cuts. According to the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, even with $1.5+ trillion in spending reductions, the bill would increase the national debt by about $3.3 trillion over the next 10 years. Trump's team disputes that figure, claiming their growth measures and reforms will pay for themselves over time, an assertion many economists are skeptical of. Nonetheless, OBB is a bold attempt to reshape the government's role, lower taxes and less social spending, while investing heavily in security and defense. Now that we know what's in the bill, let's explore how it might impact the United States, both for better and for worse. Impact on the United States. Economic impacts. Potential positives. Supporters of the One Big Beautiful Bill argue it will be a game changer for the U.S. economy. Here are the positive effects they envision: boosted economic growth and jobs. By dramatically cutting taxes for individuals and businesses, the bill aims to stimulate investment and consumer spending. The White House's Council of Economic Advisors released rosy projections. They predict that making tax cuts permanent will encourage businesses to expand and hire, potentially adding millions of jobs. In fact, a preliminary analysis by a pro-tax cut think tank estimated the bill could increase long-run GDP by around 0.8% and create nearly 1 million full-time jobs in the coming years. The logic is classic supply-side economics. People have more money in their pockets from tax savings. Companies face lower tax burdens and can invest in new factories or R&D, and the economy grows faster as a result. For example, allowing full tax write-offs for new equipment and factories might spur a wave of manufacturing construction in the U.S., which means construction jobs now and more factory jobs down the line. Likewise, tax-free overtime pay might encourage Americans to work extra hours, potentially increasing overall productivity and incomes. If these optimistic scenarios pan out, Americans could see higher wages and a stronger job market over time. Benefits for working families and retirees. Middle-class families stand to gain from the extended tax cuts, no sudden tax hike in 2026, and a slightly larger child tax credit going forward. That means more take-home pay each year for tens of millions of households. A family with 2 kids, for instance, would keep an extra $400 in credit annually compared to current law, plus avoid a return to higher tax rates. While $400 isn't life-changing, combined with the broader tax relief, it contributes to household spending power. Seniors would enjoy a bigger tax cushion due to the higher standard deduction for older taxpayers, effectively a tax cut for retirees, which could help those on fixed incomes. Moreover, by raising the SALT deduction cap, even temporarily, the bill offers relief to many homeowners in suburbia who might otherwise face higher total taxes when the old cap expired. Supporters say this shows the bill isn't only about corporations. It has provisions deliberately crafted to help average Americans, especially those who work hard, overtime, tips, or who have kids or are entering retirement. Stronger national defense and security. Another domestic impact, though not economic in the usual sense, is the promise of greater security and possibly reduced crime, illegal immigration. Advocates of the bill's security measures argue that funding the border wall and expanding enforcement will reduce unlawful border crossings and the flow of drugs like fentanyl. In theory, this could improve safety in communities troubled by drug trafficking or strains on social services. The infusion of money into the military is framed as bolstering peace through strength. A stronger U.S. military could deter conflicts and protect American interests abroad, which in turn secures the homeland. Those in favor also claim there's an economic angle. Defense spending can create jobs too, in defense manufacturing and technology sectors, and lead to spin-off innovations, as military R&D often does. Border infrastructure projects will hire workers as well. So there's a short-term jobs boost in construction and defense industries from these expenditures. Deficit reduction, long-term, possibly. This point is controversial, but proponents insist that in the long run the bill will reduce deficits. How? They contend that the spending cuts to Medicaid, SNAP, etc. will continue to yield savings beyond the 10-year window, whereas some tax cuts are scheduled to remain limited. A few of the new cuts technically expire in 2028 if not extended. If future Congresses don't extend certain provisions, the revenue loss might be less than feared. And if the economy does grow substantially faster as a result of these tax reforms, The government could collect more revenue from the larger economy, even at lower rates, narrowing the deficit. In short, the Trump administration claims the bill pays for itself through growth and by curbing runaway entitlement spending. Many economists doubt it will fully pay for itself, but even they acknowledge that higher growth could offset a portion of the cost. The most optimistic scenario has the debt to GDP ratio stabilizing a bit in a decade if growth is supercharged, though most call this wishful thinking. Still, from a supply-side perspective, the potential of a more dynamic economy and leaner government is seen as a long-term positive for American prosperity. Those are the upsides as billed by Trump and his allies: a turbocharged economy, more money in everyday Americans' wallets, a safer nation, and maybe even a fiscally sustainable future if all goes according to plan. Negative impacts and concerns. However, the bill also carries significant risks and criticisms. Let's examine the other side, the potential negative effects on the U.S. ballooning. National debt. The loudest criticism is that this legislation blows a giant hole in the federal budget. Nonpartisan analysts like the CBO estimate an added $3 trillion or more will be piled onto the national debt over the next decade because of OBB. To put that in context, the U.S. was already $36 trillion in debt, and this would accelerate that climb. Independent economists warn that such deficit-financed tax cuts could drive up interest rates over time, as the government competes for borrowing, and rekindle inflationary pressures. Basically, overheating the economy with stimulus at a time when unemployment is low. Indeed, in May 2025, Moody's, a major credit rating agency, downgraded the U.S. government's credit rating for the first time in over a century, explicitly citing concerns that extending Trump's tax cuts without offsets will worsen America's fiscal outlook. This downgrade was a flashing red light. It implies less confidence that the U.S. will get its debt under control, potentially raising borrowing costs for the Treasury. If investors demand higher interest to buy U.S. bonds, that means more taxpayer money going toward interest payments instead of programs. In the worst-case scenario, critics fear a debt spiral or a future fiscal crisis if the government continues on this path, something that could ultimately force painful cuts or broad tax hikes down the road. In summary, the immediate winners of the bill, taxpayers today, could be leaving a hefty bill for future generations. Impact on inequality and social safety net. While the bill gives across-the-board tax relief, the biggest dollar benefits go to higher-income individuals and corporations, much like the 2017 tax law did. By making those cuts permanent, the wealthy continue to enjoy lower top tax rates, a bigger estate tax exemption, and so on. Meanwhile, some low-income Americans may actually end up worse off due to the spending cuts. Taking away or reducing Medicaid and SNAP benefits hits the poorest families the hardest, potentially widening inequality. An estimated 12 million people losing Medicaid means more uninsured Americans, which often leads to higher medical debt or untreated illnesses in those communities. Cutting food assistance could increase poverty and food insecurity, especially among children and seniors who rely on those programs. So opponents argue the bill is fundamentally taking from the poor to give to the rich. For instance, a billionaire heir will keep enjoying a lax estate tax and various deductions, while a single mother who can't meet new work requirements might lose her health coverage or food aid. Ethically and economically, that trade-off is controversial. Over time, reduced access to healthcare and nutrition can also have broader social costs. A less healthy workforce, lower educational outcomes for hungry children, and higher state-local expenses as those governments try to pick up the slack. Millions left vulnerable. Real human impacts underlie these numbers. Healthcare experts warn that work requirements sound reasonable but often result in eligible people getting cut off because of bureaucratic hurdles. Someone working 2 part-time jobs might struggle to file the proper paperwork each month and get dropped from Medicaid erroneously. The CBO's projection of nearly 12 million losing insurance indicates many working poor would fall through the cracks, not because they're lazy, but due to the complexity of new rules or fluctuations in their employment. Likewise, the plan to refocus SNAP on original groups might mean many low-income adults without children, even if they're barely making ends meet, would no longer qualify for food help. Local communities could see spikes in demand at food banks and charities. The bill does try to frame it as trimming waste and abuse, but in programs like SNAP and Medicaid, fraud rates are actually relatively low. Most of the savings inevitably come from simply serving fewer people or scaling back benefits. Social workers and hospitals are bracing for an uptick in need if this passes fully. In short, the social safety net would shrink substantially, raising concerns about increased hardship for America's most vulnerable populations. Short-term disruptions and uncertainty. Another downside is the climate of uncertainty and disruption the bill might create in the short run. For example, while businesses enjoy tax cuts, many industries, healthcare, clean energy, higher education, face upheaval. A hospital in a poor region might worry that Medicaid cuts will leave them with unpaid bills as more uninsured patients show up at the ER, potentially leading to staffing or service cuts on their end. Renewable energy companies are already warning that pulling the rug out from under solar and wind tax credits will stall projects and cost jobs. Some investments were made assuming those credits, from the 2022 law, would be around for a decade, and now they might vanish overnight. The sudden shifts in policy, especially combined with other Trump actions like tariffs, add to an atmosphere of economic uncertainty. Financial markets generally don't like uncertainty. We saw big stock market swings earlier in 2025 when Trump announced sweeping tariffs. More on that in the global section. The same goes for domestic markets. The initial prospect of huge deficit spending and a potential Fed reaction made investors jittery, contributing to volatility in stocks and bonds this year. Businesses also have to plan for the possibility that parts of these cuts are temporary, set to expire in a few years to meet budget rules, meaning another fiscal cliff down the road if not extended. In essence, the policy whiplash, major tax and spending changes, can create winners and losers quickly and make it hard for some sectors to plan ahead. Political polarization and public backlash. Finally, it's worth noting the political impact at home. This bill is highly divisive. Polls show that while tax cuts in general are popular, many Americans are uneasy with cutting healthcare and food programs to achieve them. If millions start to feel negative effects like loss of benefits or seeing local services strained, there could be a public backlash. We're already seeing intense protests from senior groups worried about Medicare's future. Though Medicare itself isn't directly cut here, they fear it could be next. And from disability advocates who argue work requirements for Medicaid don't make sense for people with invisible illnesses. Democrats are framing the bill as an elite giveaway and warning it will force painful choices like cuts to Social Security down the line. Should the negative consequences manifest, the political winds could shift, potentially leading to reversals in the next election cycle. In other words, the domestic impact isn't just economic. It could reshape the U.S. political landscape, energizing opposition and affecting trust in government if the deficit soars or services decline. In summary, for the United States, Trump's one big beautiful bill is a double-edged sword. It promises economic stimulation, more money for many taxpayers and stronger security. But it also raises alarms about fiscal sustainability and social consequences for the poor and middle class. The reality will depend on whether the optimistic growth projections come true. If they don't, America could be left with a heavier debt load and a frayed safety net, with not enough economic gain to show for it. As of now, it's a grand experiment in policy with high stakes. Now, the U.S. isn't the only player affected. What about the rest of the world? Let's turn to how this bill and the broader Trump second-term agenda impact other countries, global markets, and international relations. Impacts on the rest of the world. When the United States makes a major economic move, especially one involving trillions of dollars, the effects don't stop at its borders. Donald Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill, along with its accompanying policies, is sending shockwaves through global finance, trade, and geopolitics. Here's how. Geopolitical ripple effects. One immediate global impact is the signal the bill sends about America's priorities, defense spending and military posture. By ramping up U.S. defense spending, especially with an eye toward the Pacific, The bill telegraphs a tougher U.S. stance on security matters overseas. Allies in Europe and Asia have taken note. For example, countries like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, which are wary of China's rise, largely welcome a stronger U.S. military commitment in their region. A beefed-up U.S. Navy and missile defense could act as a deterrent against potential adversaries, China or North Korea, providing reassurance to these allies that America has their back. NATO allies in Europe might similarly breathe a bit easier knowing the U.S. is investing in military readiness, though some European diplomats privately worry that Trump's focus is more on Asia and border issues than on traditional transatlantic defense. However, adversaries or rivals see it differently. China and Russia have criticized the U.S. defense buildup as provocative. More U.S. missiles and troops near China's sphere could escalate the arms race and heighten tensions. Indeed, China has already responded by accelerating its own military modernization. The risk is a more militarized global atmosphere, a new kind of Cold War dynamic, if each side keeps upping the ante. This bill, by channeling huge funds into weaponry, may contribute to that cycle. Immigration and diplomacy. Trump's aggressive immigration enforcement plans also have international implications. If the U.S. significantly steps up deportations, that can strain relationships with the countries receiving those deportees, many in Central America, the Caribbean, and Africa. For instance, Mexico and Guatemala could suddenly see tens of thousands of people sent back every month, people who might not have strong support networks there. This can create economic and social burdens on those countries, and they have, in the past, protested U.S. policies that don't consider those impacts. In diplomatic talks, immigration is often a point of contention. These policies could make cooperation on other issues harder if those governments feel the U.S. is just offloading problems onto them. Additionally, significantly raising visa fees and taxing remittances could sour public sentiment toward the U.S. in countries like Mexico, the Philippines, or India, which send many workers, students to America. It might be seen as the U.S. profiting off foreigners or making it harder for ordinary people to engage. Some countries might retaliate with their own measures or align more with competitors like China as a result. Trade and global economic implications. Perhaps the most immediate worldwide effects come through trade and financial markets. While the One Big Beautiful Bill itself is about taxes and spending, it's part of a larger Trump economic agenda that's been, to put it mildly, unpredictable for global trade. In early 2025, alongside pushing this bill, President Trump shocked the world by announcing sweeping tariffs on imports from most countries, a move he dubbed Liberation Day for American trade. Tariffs as high as 100% plus on a wide range of goods were declared, sending tremors through global markets. Trading partners were stunned and many retaliated. For instance, China slapped huge tariffs on U.S. exports and even temporarily halted exports of critical rare earth minerals, which are vital for tech and defense industries. This tit-for-tat raised fears of a full-blown trade war that could drag the world economy into a slump. In fact, the stock market took a nosedive right after those announcements. The S&P 500 lost over $5 trillion in value in days, as investors feared supply chain chaos and higher costs. The uncertainty forced Trump to partially backtrack. He paused many of the tariffs, except on China, to negotiate. By mid-2025, there's been some cooling. The U.S. and China reached a framework trade deal where China agreed to resume shipments of rare earths, and both sides eased certain tariffs. Trump even hinted at a forthcoming trade understanding with India and held talks with the EU. These developments have calmed markets a bit and prevented the worst-case scenario of a global recession triggered by a trade war. But the episode left scars. International investors and governments now view the U.S. as a less predictable trading partner. Longtime allies in Europe, for example, were taken aback that Trump's tariffs didn't spare them at first. This has accelerated conversations in the EU about not being so dependent on the U.S. market or leadership. There's even quiet chatter in Europe about strengthening ties with China if the U.S. is going to be erratic, a notion unthinkable a few years ago. So how does the Big Beautiful Bill fit into this? The bill's tax changes could alter global trade and investment flows in subtle ways. Lower corporate taxes and special breaks for U.S. manufacturing might attract some companies to relocate factories to America. For instance, a foreign car maker might decide to build its next plant in the U.S. to benefit from new expensing rules or to ensure customers can deduct their car loan interest by buying an American-made car. This could come at the expense of production in, say, Mexico or Canada, or even overseas in Europe. Those countries might lose some jobs or investment as capital shifts toward the U.S. chasing tax advantages. Such shifts aren't immediate, but over a few years could be noticeable. Trading partners could respond by adjusting their own tax policies to stay competitive, possibly a round of global tax competition that could reduce public revenues in multiple countries. Moreover, the bill's repeal of U.S. clean energy incentives might impact global industries. For example, European and Chinese companies that export solar panels, wind turbines, or electric cars to the U.S. were poised to benefit from American subsidies boosting demand. If those subsidies vanish, U.S. demand for green tech might be lower, which could hurt those exporters and slow global progress on climate initiatives. In climate diplomacy, other nations are expressing disappointment. The U.S. seems to be reneging on its climate leadership by not only withdrawing incentives, but actively promoting fossil fuel extraction through more leases and weaker emissions rules. This creates friction in international climate talks. Some countries might use the U.S. stance as an excuse to water down their own commitments. Why should we cut emissions if the U.S. isn't doing its part? On the trade front, another element is the digital service taxes and global minimum tax issue. Under the prior administration, the U.S. agreed, in principle, to a global 15% minimum corporate tax to prevent profit shifting. Trump's bill and approach show little interest in implementing that. In fact, the bill includes a foreign corporate retaliation tax, which is basically aimed at countries that impose extra taxes on U.S. tech giants. It says, if you tax our companies, we'll tax your companies doing business here. This could complicate relations with European allies like France or the UK who have digital service taxes. It might lead to trade skirmishes if enacted, as those countries feel targeted. The broader message is the U.S. is going its own way on international tax cooperation, which could fragment the previously coordinated effort to tax multinationals fairly. Global financial markets and the dollar. One of the clearest signals of the rest of world impact has been the reaction of currency and bond markets. The U.S. dollar has been sliding in value in 2025, and analysts tie it partly to Trump's economic policies and the big bill working through Congress. In fact, the dollar had its worst first half of year performance in decades. Why? Global investors traditionally see the U.S. dollar and treasuries as the ultimate safe haven, a stable store of value in uncertain times. But with the U.S. embarking on unpredictable tariff battles and a giant unfunded tax cut, confidence in U.S. economic management has been shaken. Investors worry that the combination of rising U.S. debt and political pressure on institutions — Trump has frequently criticized the Federal Reserve, raising concern about the Fed's independence — makes holding U.S. assets riskier than before. Some central banks around the world have responded by diversifying away from the dollar, buying record amounts of gold, and considering more euro or yuan assets to reduce reliance on the U.S. currency. A weaker dollar has mixed consequences globally. On one hand, it makes U.S. exports cheaper and imports into the U.S. more expensive. Countries that export a lot to America, like many Asian nations, could see demand for their goods drop because the dollar's value is down or because tariffs make their products costlier in the U.S. This can slow growth in export-dependent economies. On the other hand, a weaker dollar eases pressure on some emerging markets that have dollar-denominated debt. Their debt becomes slightly easier to service if their own currencies strengthen relative to the dollar. But the underlying cause of the dollar's drop, lost confidence, is not something to celebrate. If the trend continued, it could threaten the dollar's global reserve currency status in the long term. That status gives the U.S. tremendous advantages, like being able to borrow in its own currency cheaply. Other powers such as China and Russia would be quite happy to see the dollar's dominance erode, and some analysts think Trump's go-it-alone policies are inadvertently weaponizing the rest of the world to reduce their dollar dependence. Additionally, as mentioned earlier, the U.S. credit downgrade by Moody's, and earlier by Fitch, is echoing through the financial world. While U.S. Treasuries are still considered very safe, the downgrade to AA1, one notch below the top, has made some conservative funds, and even foreign governments with rules about credit ratings, reconsider their holdings. If demand for U.S. bonds falls, the U.S. might have to offer higher interest rates to attract buyers. That can push global interest rates up, since U.S. rates often set a benchmark. Higher global interest rates can dampen investment and growth worldwide. We already saw Treasury yields jump after the downgrade news. Other countries' bonds moved in sympathy. There's also a concern about a potential bond market rout. If big holders like international investors or sovereign wealth funds start dumping U.S. Treasuries out of fear of long-term unsustainability, it could cause turmoil in financial markets worldwide. That hasn't happened in a major way. U.S. bonds are still in demand for now. But the fact it's being discussed shows how a domestic U.S. policy can instill uncertainty far beyond its borders. International trade relationships, Trump's America First approach, tax changes favoring domestic production, aggressive tariff tactics, and now even attacks on foreign remittances, is prompting many countries to rethink their trade relationships with the U.S. Some U.S. allies feel they need to hedge their bets. For example, members of the European Union have been deepening trade discussions among themselves and with other partners in Asia, partly to reduce reliance on the fickle U.S. market. They were already surprised by the U.S. retreat from some global roles in Trump's first term. The second term is reinforcing that perception. In trade blocs and international forums, there's a palpable sense that U.S. leadership is less dependable, so others might need to fill the void. We see the OECD adjusting down U.S. growth forecasts for 2025 due to these uncertainties, which in turn led them to cut the global growth outlook. Slower U.S. growth or erratic U.S. policy tends to drag on global growth because the U.S. is a huge consumer in the world economy. For instance, countries supplying steel, electronics, or agricultural goods to the U.S. are anxious that either tariffs or a U.S. slowdown will hurt their industries. Conversely, if the tax cuts do stimulate U.S. growth significantly, a big if, it could have a modest positive spillover. A booming U.S. economy would import more goods from abroad, potentially helping those trade partners' economies. Historically, a U.S. tax cut can boost U.S. demand for everything from German cars to Mexican appliances to Australian minerals. So there is a scenario where, despite the disruptions, the net effect by late decade is a stronger U.S. economy that is a locomotive for global growth. But at least in the near term, institutions like the World Bank and IMF are cautioning that the instability from policy swings is the dominant factor, not any marginal growth bump. Climate and global leadership. One cannot overlook the global climate leadership aspect. Under the prior administration, the U.S. had rejoined international climate efforts and was investing heavily in clean energy, which also meant funding projects that involved foreign companies and setting an example for others. Now, with the U.S. rolling back those investments and incentives, global climate advocates worry about a chilling effect. Countries that were on the fence about aggressive climate action might back off, citing U.S. backpedaling. The absence of U.S. federal support for green tech could slow advancements that benefit everyone, like cheaper solar panels or battery breakthroughs. In fact, some European leaders have openly criticized the One Big Beautiful Bill's climate portions, saying it undercuts the spirit of the Paris Agreement. We may see more international pressure on the U.S. at climate summits, or conversely, the U.S. just disengaging from that conversation, leaving a leadership void that the EU or China might try to fill. To sum up the international perspective, the rest of the world is watching a financially mighty but increasingly unpredictable United States, trying to gauge how to react. Some impacts, like currency shifts and market jitters, have already been felt. Others, like changes in trade patterns or military posturing, will play out over years. The bill's passage, if fully finalized, would confirm that America is embracing an economic strategy heavy on domestic stimulus and light on fiscal restraint or global coordination. This could lead to a more fragmented global order, where countries diversify their alliances and currencies, and where the US and China continue a tense dance of competition, both military and economic. For US allies, the bill is a mixed bag. They appreciate a stronger US defense commitment, but they worry about global economic fallout and the US seeming inward-focused, especially with those big cuts to foreign aid or international programs, not explicitly in the bill, but part of Trump's budget ethos. For rivals, the bill presents opportunities. They can cast the US as fiscally reckless and try to position their currency or system as more stable. In international finance, the US still holds the cards largely, but confidence is a fragile thing. Regaining trust after such turbulence might be a challenge. Trade tensions, geopolitical shifts, financial tremors, all are on the table because of this sweeping US policy choice. As one foreign commentator put it, when America sneezes, the world catches a cold. And America is doing some very loud sneezing right now. Conclusion. Key takeaways. As we've seen, Donald Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill is indeed big and beautiful to some, and deeply troubling to others. What are the key takeaways? A bold, unprecedented package. This bill packs in virtually the entire wish list of Trump's agenda: permanent tax cuts, targeted tax breaks for workers and businesses, a surge in defense and border spending, and sweeping cuts to welfare programs, all in one. It's an audacious attempt to reshape the U.S. economy and government in a single stroke. In scope and ambition, it's unlike almost any legislation in recent memory. Potential upsides. If everything goes right, supporters believe Americans will see stronger economic growth, more jobs, and fatter paychecks. Middle-class families avoid a looming tax increase and even get a small tax credit boost. Businesses big and small find it easier to invest and hire. The U.S. military gets a needed upgrade, and the border is reinforced, which proponents say will enhance security and sovereignty. In essence, it's pitched as unleashing American prosperity and protecting American interests, all at once. Major risks and costs. However, the plan comes with serious risks. The price tag, largely debt-financed, threatens to blow up the deficit and add trillions to a national debt that is already sky-high, raising the specter of future fiscal crises or tough sacrifices ahead. Domestically, millions could lose health coverage or food assistance, widening the gap between haves and have-nots. The gains from the tax cuts tilt heavily toward the wealthy and corporations, fueling criticism that it's inequality on steroids. And if the growth doesn't materialize as hoped, the country could end up with the worst of both worlds: massive debt and an underperforming economy. Political and social fallout. The bill has proven incredibly divisive. It squeaked through Congress on party-line votes, reflecting a sharply polarized nation. Depending on its outcomes, it could become a point of pride, the Trump boom of 2025, or a cautionary tale, the big, beautiful bust. Socially, it tests the balance between encouraging self-reliance and ensuring a safety net, a debate at the core of American values. We may see significant political mobilization from those affected, e.g. low-income communities, seniors, immigrants, which could influence elections and policy for years to come. In other words, the fight doesn't end with the bill's passage. It likely marks the beginning of a new chapter of political contention over America's future direction. Global impact. Beyond U.S. borders, the reverberations are already being felt. Allies and adversaries alike are adjusting to a United States that is simultaneously more assertive, militarily and in trade demands, and seemingly less fiscally stable. Global markets have responded with caution: a weaker dollar, rating downgrades, and investors hedging their bets. If the U.S. stumbles under higher debt or unpredictable policy swings, the world economy could suffer and global leadership dynamics could shift. Conversely, if the U.S. economy soars, it might give a jolt of growth abroad as well. Thus, many nations find themselves hoping for the best but preparing for the worst in response to this new American experiment. In the end, Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill is a grand gamble. It strives to supercharge the economy and fulfill long-standing conservative goals in one fell swoop. Its success or failure will likely define the economic legacy of Trump's second term, and potentially shape the global economic landscape in the late 2020s. As with any gamble, there's exhilaration at the possibilities and anxiety at the risks. For now, all eyes are on Washington. Will this sweeping bill truly deliver beautiful results, or will it bring unintended consequences? The coming years will provide the answer. One thing is certain: the debate it has sparked about taxes versus spending, growth versus inequality, and America's role in the world will remain at the forefront of public discourse. Key takeaway: Donald Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill encapsulates a vision of unleashed American growth and strength. But achieving that vision comes at the cost of higher debt and deep cuts that touch the lives of millions. Its impact will be felt not just at home, but around the globe. Whether it leads to economic rejuvenation or new challenges, it marks a defining moment, a bold bet on the future of the United States and its place in the world. That's the story so far. Thank you for watching, and let us know in the comments. Do you think this One Big Beautiful Bill will succeed or backfire? Let's discuss.